The station hung above Earth like a silver needle caught in amber light. It was called Meridian, and it had been built 40 years ago as a place for trade talks and diplomatic ceremonies. It had hosted delegations from 11 different species. It had seen agreements signed, broken, and renegotiated. It had seen a lot of things, but the people who staffed it agreed, quietly and without putting it in writing, that they had never seen anything quite like the Keth. Ambassador Sela arrived with no advance notice beyond the minimum required by Galactic courtesy law. 14 hours. That was all Earth got. 14 hours to prepare a reception for a representative of the largest empire in the known galaxy, a civilization that had swallowed 32 worlds in 4 centuries and had never once lost a war. The station crew cleaned. The council members were pulled from their offices, their homes, their beds. Admiral Yara Austin flew up from the surface on a shuttle that smelled like old coffee and hydraulic fluid, and she sat in her seat in the reception hall and watched the Keth delegation walk through the docking bay doors like they already owned the floor beneath their feet. Sela was tall, even by Keth standards. Her skin was the color of old slate, and her 4 eyes moved constantly, cataloging everything they touched. She wore ceremonial armor that was not purely ceremonial. The Keth did not believe in the distinction. She walked to the table, did not sit, and placed a single silver case on the surface in front of her. She opened it. Inside was a document printed on material that was not paper and not plastic, and it was exactly 3 pages long. She did not read it aloud. She simply said that Earth had 30 days. Counselor Marin Cho, seated to Austin's left, asked 30 days for what? Sela looked at her the way a person looks at a question they find genuinely tedious. She said 30 days to complete the transfer of governmental authority to Keth administrators, to begin disarmament of all orbital and surface military installations, and to register Earth's population for labor classification. She said it the way someone says a list of grocery items. She said the casualty projections for non-compliance were included on page 3, and that the Keth considered them conservative estimates. Nobody at the table said anything for a moment. Then Admiral Austin asked, quietly, if that was everything. Sela looked at her. Something moved behind those 4 eyes. Not surprise exactly. More like the faint curiosity a person might feel when an animal does something slightly unexpected. She said yes, that was everything. Austin nodded and thanked her. She said the council would consider the terms and that the ambassador was welcome to use the station's guest quarters. Then she stood up, and the session was over. Sela had expected many things. Tears had been known to happen. Shouting was common. Once, on a world called Verath IV, a council member had fainted. She had not expected to be thanked and shown to her room like a visiting academic. She went to her quarters and sent a short report to the fleet waiting beyond the system's edge. She wrote that the humans appeared to be in shock and that compliance was probable. She believed this when she wrote it. Behind closed doors, in a room with no windows and a table that had seen better decades, the council fell apart in the way that people fall apart when they are genuinely frightened and genuinely responsible, and both of those things at the same time. Marin Cho laid out the numbers. Not the Keth numbers, Earth's own numbers. Fleet strength, weapons range, response time, allied commitments. She put them next to the Keth's numbers, which were publicly known, because the Keth had never seen a reason to hide them. The comparison was not a comparison. It was an explanation of why there was no comparison. She said that they needed to negotiate, that some worlds had survived Keth integration with partial autonomy intact, that there were precedents, frameworks, international advocates who had worked with Keth administrators before. She said the word negotiate 4 times in 3 minutes, and she was not wrong to say it. Austin listened to all of it. She sat at the end of the table with her hands flat on the surface, and she listened without interrupting, which was a thing she was good at in the same way that deep water is good at being still. When Cho finished, Austin reached into the inner pocket of her uniform jacket and placed a small data chip on the table. Cho looked at it, Austin said they had already prepared a response. Sho picked up the chip and turned it over in her fingers. She asked what was on it. Austin said coordinates. Sho asked coordinates to what? Austin said she should get some sleep, that the morning would be long. She picked the chip back up, stood and left the room, and the remaining council members sat with the specific silence of people who have just realized that someone else in the building has been playing a longer game than they knew existed. Sela was given the chip the next morning by a junior aide who offered her tea at the same time. The aide was young and polite and smiled in a way that did not carry any weight behind it. Sela took the chip and asked where the response letter was. The aide said there was no letter. Sela asked if there was a spokesperson she could speak with. The aide said Admiral Austin had returned to the surface and that the council was in recess. Sela held the chip. She asked what was on it. The aide smiled again and said she honestly wasn't sure, and offered the tea a second time. Back on her ship, Sela's technical staff read the chip in under a minute. They put the contents on the main display. Every person in the room looked at it. Nobody said anything for a long time. The contents were exactly what Austin had said they were. A string of numbers, spatial coordinates, deep space, well outside any charted territory of interest, nowhere near Earth, nowhere near anything. No message, no context, no signature. Just the numbers, formatted correctly, precise down to 6 decimal points, as if someone had taken a great deal of care making sure the location was exact. One of Sela's staff asked if the humans had made a mistake. Sela stared at the display. She thought about the Admiral's face when she had asked if that was everything. The complete absence of the thing she had expected to find there. She thought about the aide with the tea and the smile that didn't carry any weight. She sent the coordinates to Fleet Sovereign Drath Vel and wrote that she was not certain yet what they meant, but that she did not think it was a mistake. She stood at the viewport for a while after she sent it, looking at the blue and white shape of Earth sitting in the dark below. It did not look like a world that had been building something. It did not look like a world with a plan. It looked ordinary, quiet, small. She had learned over a long career that this was sometimes the most dangerous kind of look a thing could have. But she had also learned that empires were not built on hesitation, and so she filed her report, finished her tea, and waited for Vel to respond. She was almost certain he would laugh. She was hopping in a small and careful part of herself that she rarely listened to, that he would also be careful. He was not careful. Below, on Earth's surface, in an office that overlooked a garden that needed cutting, Admiral Austin received confirmation that the chip had been read and transmitted onward. She sat at her desk for a while. She thought about Dov Rask, who she had not spoken to in almost 2 years, who existed in no public record connected to anything military, who had once told her that the hardest part of building something meant to never be found was resisting the urge to tell anyone about it. She thought he had done a remarkable job of resisting that urge. She thought the Keth were going to go to those coordinates. She had built the response on the certainty of that, on the knowledge that an empire that had never lost did not know how to receive a strange answer without walking toward it. Curiosity and arrogance lived close together, in humans and in everyone else. They would go. She pulled out a piece of paper, actual paper, which she preferred for things that mattered, and wrote a single line on it. She folded it and put it in the top drawer of her desk. It was not an order. It was not a report. It was just a note she had written to herself some time ago and kept updating, and the current version said, "They asked for our answer and we gave them our answer, and now we wait and see if they understood the question." Outside the window, the garden moved a little in the wind. She waited. Fleet Sovereign Drath Vel received the coordinates while eating breakfast. This was not unusual. He received most things while eating breakfast. Because a Fleet Sovereign's day began before the artificial lighting on the ship had finished warming to full strength, and because there was always something arriving, status reports, resource tallies, planetary compliance updates from the 32 worlds that fed the Empire its taxes and its labor, and its quiet, grinding submission. He was a man who had made a career out of receiving bad news without spilling his drink, and he considered this one of his more useful qualities. He read the coordinates. He read them again. He set down his cup and looked across the table at his senior tactical officer, a lean and efficient woman named Vor, who had already seen the transmission and was watching him with the careful expression of someone waiting to find out whether to laugh. He laughed first. It started small and built into something genuine, the kind of laugh that comes from real surprise, which was itself a surprise, because Vel had not been genuinely surprised by anything in 11 years. He put the data chip on the table and pushed it toward Vor and told her to find out what was at those coordinates. She said her analysts had already started. He picked up his cup again and finished his breakfast. The report came back in 2 hours. Deep space. No star within 4 light-years of significance. No charted stations, no colony markers, no debris fields from any logged engagement. The closest thing to a point of interest was a minor gravitational anomaly that the analysts said was probably a rogue planetoid too small and too dark to have earned a catalog number. The coordinates pointed to an area that was, by every measure available to the finest sensor arrays in the Keth fleet, absolutely nothing. Vor presented this with a straight face. One of the junior officers behind her did not quite manage the same. Vel saw it and did not punish it because he felt, privately, that the situation had earned a little levity. He asked his staff what they thought it meant. The answers came in the way answers always come when senior officers are asked open questions by men who hold their careers in their hands, carefully, and shaped toward what the asker seemed to want to hear. The first theory was that the humans were offering a resource deposit, perhaps something they had discovered, and not yet logged, a gesture of goodwill dressed up in mystery, because humans apparently conducted even their surrenders with unnecessary drama. The second theory was that the coordinates were a mistake, a clerical error produced by a species in the advanced stages of institutional panic, and that the real response was still being drafted somewhere in a government building full of frightened people. The third theory, offered by a very young analyst who had clearly not yet learned the full art of reading the room, was that it was a trap. Vel looked at the young analyst for a moment. He asked how many ships Earth had capable of threatening a Keth battle group. The analyst said 11, maybe 13 if you counted the converted freighters that had been fitted with weapons of limited range and questionable reliability. Vel nodded and asked how many ships were currently sitting outside this system. The analyst said 407. Vel said yes, and thanked him for his contribution, and the young analyst sat down and said nothing else for the remainder of the meeting. The prevailing consensus, once the room had settled, was that the humans had lost their nerve and their minds in roughly equal measure, and that the coordinates were some form of offering, pathetic in scale, probably, but an offering nonetheless. A mining operation, a fuel cache, a research station they hoped to trade for leniency, something small and quiet and meant to show willing. Vel decided to look, not with the full fleet, that would have been an extravagance, but with a scout wing. 7 fast ships, light armament, excellent sensors, enough to catalog whatever was there and bring back images that could be added to the file Earth's surrender would eventually generate. Every world that had come into the Empire had a file. Vel liked the files to be complete. The scout wing left within the hour. Their commander was a capable officer named Thresh, who had done this kind of survey work a dozen times, and who treated the assignment with exactly the level of seriousness he felt it deserved, which was not very much. He sent a brief message to his wife before jumping to the coordinates. He said he would be back before the week was out, and that the assignment was nothing, a look-hand report on a patch of empty space, the sort of thing given to scout wings when the real work hadn't started yet. Vel returned to the business of managing an invasion timeline. There were logistics to settle, administrative teams to deploy, a timetable for Earth's disarmament that needed to be realistic without being generous. He had done this before. It was detailed work and he was good at it. He spent the better part of 3 days on it and barely thought about the coordinates at all. On the fourth day, Thresh's wing sent its first transmission. It arrived fragmented, which was unusual for Keth military communications equipment, which was not in the habit of fragmenting. The signal reconstruction took 20 minutes, and what it produced was not a survey report. It was a single short-band burst, unencrypted, broadcast on the standard emergency frequency that scout wings used when they needed to reach the fleet quickly and did not have time for proper channels. The message had been sent from all 7 ships simultaneously, which meant Thresh had ordered it fleet-wide rather than running it through his own command console, which meant something had happened quickly enough that he had not wanted to wait for the relay. It said one word. The word was stop, and it was printed in 17 different languages, one after another in a column, including Keth, which was listed first out of what could only have been deliberate choice. The other 16 languages included 3 that the Keth had never officially taught anyone outside their own administrative corps, which meant whoever had composed that message had done their research, and had done it well ahead of time, and had been ready with it. After the word stop, the transmission ended. Then the 7 ships went silent. Vel stood in the center of his command bridge and looked at the display for a long time without speaking. Around him, his officers were running checks, signal traces, emergency beacon sweeps, long-range mass sensors looking for debris, for hull fragments, for anything that indicated what had happened to 7 military vessels crewed by 431 Keth personnel, in a patch of space that the sensors had said contained absolutely nothing. The sensors found nothing now either. No debris, no beacon response, no residual energy signature consistent with weapons discharge. 7 ships had gone to a location and sent one word and gone quiet, and the space where they had been was clean and still and indifferent. Vor came to stand beside him. She did not offer a theory. She had learned over years of working with him when theories were welcome and when silence was the better contribution. This was a silence moment. Vel asked for the coordinates again. They put them on the main display. He looked at them for a while. He thought about the human admiral who had thanked Ambassador Sela and ended the session without a word out of place, who had asked only one question and seemed satisfied by the answer, who had sent a data chip with no letter and no signature and no explanation. He thought about what kind of person sends coordinates as a response to an extinction threat and includes no other context. He thought about the young analyst's theory, which he had dismissed in a room full of people and had not stopped thinking about since. He turned to Vor and told her to prepare the fleet. She asked if they were jumping to the coordinates. He said yes. She asked with how many ships. He said all of them. She did not argue. She was too experienced to argue at a moment like this, and also she had been thinking about the 17 languages since the transmission came in, and about how much preparation it took to have a message ready in 17 languages before a scout wing had even arrived, and about how that kind of preparation did not belong to a species that had lost its nerve. She went to prepare the fleet. Vel stayed on the bridge and looked at the coordinates on the display. He was not afraid. He had not been afraid in a long time, and he was not going to start now, because fear was a thing that happened to people who had not made sufficient preparations, and Vel had always made sufficient preparations. He told himself this clearly and with conviction. He almost believed it. Outside the viewports, the stars were steady and cold, and very far away. And between them the dark was full of distances that even an empire 4 centuries old had not fully measured, and somewhere in that dark, at the end of a string of numbers sent by a quiet woman who had asked no questions and made no threats, something was waiting. It had been waiting, he was beginning to understand, for quite some time. The Keth fleet dropped out of jump in perfect formation. 407 warships, arranged in the layered assault configuration that had broken planetary defenses on 19 different worlds. Vel's flagship sat at the center, surrounded by destroyer screens and capital ships whose weapons could crack the crust of a small moon. The formation was a thing of genuine military beauty, disciplined and vast, and it had never failed to produce the intended effect on anyone who had ever seen it materialize out of a jump wake. The intended effect was despair. What the fleet materialized into was darkness and silence, and for the first 30 seconds every sensor array on every ship reported the same thing they had reported from a distance: empty space, a minor gravitational anomaly to the galactic south, nothing of consequence. The coordinates sat at the center of a void that seemed to actively resist being interesting, and for half a minute the 407 ships of the Keth battle fleet hung in that void and pointed their guns at nothing. Then the sensors started returning strange numbers. It began on the outer picket ships, the ones whose job was to watch the edges of the formation while the center did its work. Their mass detectors began logging contacts, small ones at first, the kind that could be mistaken for sensor drift or cosmic debris, but contacts nonetheless, appearing in the dark at distances of 2 and 3 light minutes, arranged in directions that made no geometric sense for natural objects. Then more contacts, then more. The reports came into Vel's command bridge in a steady stream that started as a trickle and became, over the course of about 4 minutes, something that made his senior sensor officer stop speaking mid-sentence and simply put the full display on the main screen without finishing his report. The main screen showed structures. Thousands of them. They were not ships. The profiles were wrong for ships, too large in some dimensions and too narrow in others, clearly stationary, clearly anchored in position by something that wasn't gravity alone. They were spread across an area of space so large that the fleet's sensors, even at full extension, could not find the edges of the field. They were dark, completely dark. No running lights, no heat signature, no electromagnetic output of any kind. They sat in the black like teeth in a jaw that hadn't opened yet, arrayed in a geometric pattern so precise that it could only have been designed, and designed carefully, by minds that understood the mathematics of three-dimensional space better than they understood the need to advertise what they were doing in it. Vor counted the contacts on the display and stopped counting at 2,000. She asked quietly how long it would take to build something like this. Nobody answered her. The question was not really looking for an answer. It was the kind of question that arrives when the mind is trying to buy itself time to accept something it isn't ready to accept yet. Vel stood at the center of his bridge and looked at the display and did the thing he had trained himself to do in moments of genuine operational surprise, which was to stop, breathe, and separate what he knew from what he was assuming. What he knew was that there were structures. What he knew was that they were dark and cold and gave no sign of being active. What he knew was that his fleet was intact, that his weapons were online, that 407 ships with full combat capability were sitting in formation around him, and nothing had fired at them and nothing had moved. What he was assuming was that dark meant safe. He ordered a closer approach. The formation moved inward, slowly, the outer ships maintaining distance while the center advanced, a standard investigative posture that kept the bulk of the fleet out of any potential engagement range while a smaller group moved toward the target. It was a sensible order, and his officers executed it without hesitation because they trusted his judgment, and because nothing had happened yet, and in the absence of hostile action, caution can feel like overcaution very easily. The formation crossed an invisible line in space. There was no marker, no beacon, no physical boundary of any kind that the sensors could identify. It was simply a threshold, a point in space that existed in someone's calculations and nowhere else, and the moment the outermost ships of the advancing formation crossed it, every structure in the field activated at once. It did not happen gradually. There was no warm-up, no sequence, no staggered power-on that might have given the impression of a system coming to life. One moment the structures were dark, the next moment they were not. Light appeared across the full depth of the field simultaneously, blue-white and steady, And with the light came power readings that climbed so fast on the sensor displays that two of Vel's officers thought their equipment had malfunctioned and began running diagnostics before the third officer pointed at the viewport and made a sound that was not quite a word. Through the viewport, the dark had become something else. The structures were visible now, lit from within by whatever was powering them, and at this distance and in this light Vel could see them clearly for the first time. They were not weapons platforms in any configuration he recognized. They were not stations in any conventional sense. They were something that had no Keth word attached to it, something that sat between categories, built with a logic that was clearly military but expressed in a language his training had not prepared him for. There were apertures along their surfaces, many apertures, all now open, all oriented with the kind of patient precision that spoke of targeting systems that had already done their calculations long before the fleet arrived. Then came the voice. It came through every communication system on every ship simultaneously, in Keth, spoken with an accent that was clearly human but perfectly understandable, calm in the way that deep water is calm when nothing is disturbing it yet. It said, "You were warned." That was all it said. The voice did not introduce itself. It did not issue orders or demands. It said 3 words and stopped, and the silence that followed was somehow louder than the words had been, because in that silence the fleet's sensors were reading targeting locks appearing across the formation, not on some ships, on all ships. Every vessel in the 407-ship formation was being targeted simultaneously by systems distributed across a field of structures so large that flanking it was not a realistic option. And the locks were clean and stable in the way that locks are clean and stable when the weapons producing them are not struggling to maintain them. Vel gave 3 orders in rapid succession. He ordered the fleet to hold position. He ordered weapons to ready state but not to fire. He ordered his communications officer to broadcast a request for dialogue on all frequencies. Nobody answered the broadcast. The targeting locks held. For 6 minutes nothing happened, and those 6 minutes were the longest of Vel's career, longer than engagements that had lasted hours, because in an engagement there is always something to do, and the doing of it takes up the space where fear would otherwise live. In those 6 minutes there was nothing to do. There was only the display and the locks and the structures burning blue-white in the dark, and the certain knowledge, settling into the room like cold water rising, that whatever came next was not going to be his decision. Then the structures fired. They did not fire at the ships. They fired between them. Precision shots threaded through the gaps in the formation with an accuracy that was not possible, that violated what Vel understood about targeting solutions and weapons variants, and the fundamental difficulty of hitting specific points in 3-dimensional space when those points were surrounded by objects you intended to leave intact. The shots hit drives, not hulls, not weapons systems, not crew compartments. Every shot that landed hit a drive assembly, and the drives went dark, one after another across the formation, in a sequence that moved from the outer ships inward like a hand closing deliberately around something it intended to hold rather than crush. It took 11 minutes. At the end of 11 minutes, 407 Keth warships were sitting powerless in the dark, intact, unbreached, their crews alive and uninjured. Their hulls without a mark on them that hadn't been there before. The structures returned to stillness. The targeting locks dropped. The blue-white light remained, steady and indifferent. Vel stood at the center of a dead bridge and looked at the display, which was running on emergency power now, and thought about the human admiral's face during the session at the station, and about the data chip with no letter, and about a word printed in 17 languages by someone who had been ready with it before the scouts had even arrived. He thought about the young analyst's theory. He sat down in his command chair, which was a thing he rarely did during an operation, and he put his hands on his knees, and he looked at the dark outside the viewport, where thousands of structures waited in the silence They had apparently been practicing for a very long time, and he understood, with the specific completeness of a man whose remaining uncertainties have just been resolved, that he had not come to these coordinates to inspect an offering. He had been invited to a demonstration. He had attended. He thought for the first time in 11 years about what it felt like to be afraid. The shuttles came 3 hours later. They appeared at the edge of the structure field, small against the vast dark, moving without any of the aggressive posturing that Keth vessels used when approaching a disabled enemy. They did not sweep in fast or hold a weapon's angle. They came in slowly, in a loose and unthreatening formation, running full lights, broadcasting their approach on open frequencies in Keth, so there would be no confusion about what they were doing or where they were going. They were not gunships. The sensor arrays still running on emergency power were good enough to confirm that. They were transport craft, broad-bodied and practical, the kind built for carrying equipment and people rather than for fighting, and they were heading into the formation with the unhurried confidence of workers arriving at a job site they had already surveyed. Vel watched them come on the emergency display and said nothing. His communications officer, running on a backup console powered by the bridge's auxiliary cells, told him the shuttles were hailing individual ships across the formation, not his flagship specifically. All of them, working outward from the edges inward, ship by ship, the same message each time, in Keth, polite and direct. Identify your engineering access points and prepare to receive a repair team. Vel's first officer asked if he wanted to refuse the hails. Vel thought about that for a moment. He thought about what refusing would accomplish, practically speaking, for a fleet with no drive power and no ability to maneuver, sitting in the middle of a structure field whose weapons had already demonstrated a precision that made the concept of resistance feel less like a strategy and more like a statement of mood. He told his first officer to let the hails stand and to instruct the fleet to cooperate with boarding. The word boarding sat badly in the room. It had connotations. In Keth military culture, being boarded meant defeat, meant the end of a ship's identity as a fighting vessel, meant the beginning of a process that was humiliating by design. But the shuttles that came were not running boarding protocols. What came through the airlocks of the outer ships was not soldiers with weapons drawn and defeat to administer. What came through was engineers carrying toolkits, and behind them medics with portable diagnostic equipment, and behind them support staff with supply cases. And all of them moved through the Keth vessels with the focused efficiency of people who had a lot of ships to get through and a reasonable timeline to do it in. They did not speak much. They were not rude. They answered questions put to them in whatever language the questioner used, briefly and accurately, and then they returned to their work. They checked Keth crew members for injury with the same attention they gave to checking drive assemblies. They treated the wounded. There were not many, a few crew members who had been thrown by the sudden loss of power, nothing severe, with equipment that was clearly calibrated for Keth physiology, which meant someone had done that calibration in advance, which meant this too had been prepared for long before the fleet had arrived at the coordinates. Vel noticed this and filed it in the part of his mind that was building a picture he didn't entirely want to finish. His own ship was reached on the second day. He stood in the main corridor near the engineering bay and watched a human crew move through his flagship with a competence that he found, against his will, difficult to fault. They were not showing off. That was the thing he kept returning to. A species that had just disabled 407 warships without losing a single vessel of its own would have had every right to be theatrical about the follow-up, to make the repair process into a performance of generosity, to ensure the Keth understood precisely how comprehensively they had been beaten. These people were not doing that. They were fixing drives. They were checking hull integrity. They were doing the work. On the third day, a junior member of the human engineering crew stopped near Vel in a corridor and offered him a food packet from her kit. She did it without ceremony, the way a person offers something to someone nearby who looks like they haven't eaten, which was accurate, Vel had not eaten properly in 2 days. He looked at the packet for a moment. Then he took it. She nodded and went back to her work. That was the entirety of the exchange. He ate the food in his ready room and thought about empires. On the 4th day, 2 crew members came to the flagship's main airlock and asked, through the communications officer, if Fleet Sovereign Vel would be willing to come aboard a human vessel. They said willing with a particular care that acknowledged it was in practice a request that carried more weight than its phrasing suggested. But they said it anyway, and Vel appreciated the acknowledgement even as he recognized it for what it was. He went. The human vessel was not a warship. It was something between a command ship and a transport, functional in its layout, marked throughout with the specific tidiness of a crew that lived and worked in the same space for long periods and had made their peace with that. It smelled like recycled air and metal, and something warm that he couldn't identify. He was taken through 2 corridors and a lift to a room that was plainly a meeting room, a table, chairs on both sides, a display panel on one wall currently showing nothing. There was water on the table. There was no one seated at the other side yet. He sat. He waited. The person who came in was not what he had expected, and he recognized, sitting there, that he had been expecting the Admiral. The woman whose recorded voice had delivered 3 words across 407 ships. He had constructed an image of her in his mind over the past 4 days, assembled from the session at the station and the data chip and the voice. And the image was of someone who would walk into this room the way a verdict walks into a courtroom. The person who came in was young. Not a child, but young in the way that competence sometimes wears to keep from being taken too seriously too fast. She was not in formal uniform. She wore working clothes, and she had the look of someone pulled from a task rather than prepared for a ceremony. She sat across from him and put a data chip on the table between them, and she did it the way the aide at the station had put the first chip into Sela's hand. Simply, without drama, as though the weight of the thing was self-contained and needed no additional emphasis from the person delivering it. Vel looked at the chip. He asked where Admiral Austin was. The young officer said the Admiral sent her regards. He looked at the chip again. He had commanded fleets that had broken planetary governments. He had sat across tables from leaders of worlds and watched them sign away sovereignty with shaking hands. He had received surrenders from species that had fought well and species that had not fought at all, and he had seen every variety of defeat that a sentient being could wear. He was familiar with this moment. He understood its architecture. He picked up the chip. It contained one document, not long, formatted simply, plain language, structured with the clean economy of something written by someone who had no interest in making it more complicated than it needed to be. It was a terms document. He knew the shape of terms documents. He had seen hundreds of them. He had issued most of them himself. These terms were not for Earth surrender. He read them twice. They were thorough without being punishing. They were written in a language that was firm about what it required and quiet about what it was not requiring. And what it was not requiring was destruction, humiliation, reparations, or the kind of systematic dismantling that empires usually demanded of rivals who had made themselves inconvenient. What it required was withdrawal. What it required was recognition of Earth's sovereignty, and the sovereignty of the 14 independent worlds that had requested Earth's protection in the past decade, which was a sentence that gave Vel pause, because he had not known about the 14 worlds, which meant the Keth intelligence apparatus had missed something with a decade of history behind it, which opened questions he did not have time for right now. What it required was a formal Keth acknowledgement, transmitted publicly on Galactic standard channels, that the engagement at the coordinates had occurred, and that the Keth fleet had accepted terms. It did not require an admission of defeat. It required an acknowledgement of terms. The distinction was deliberate, and Vel understood it because he had written enough of these documents himself to know that the person who had written this one understood the difference between what you needed an enemy to say and what you needed them to believe, and had chosen to go after the former rather than the latter. He set the chip down. He looked at the young officer and asked her name. She told him. He asked how old she was. She told him that too. He nodded slowly and looked at the table for a while. Then he asked if he could have something to write with. She produced a stylus. He picked up the chip and turned it over in his hand, and then he said that he had one question before he signed. She waited. He asked who built the structures. She considered the question. She said she couldn't give him the person's name, but that she could tell him he was an engineer who had spent 14 years on the project, and that he had done most of the early design work alone, before the program received formal resources, because he had believed in the necessity of it before anyone with authority had caught up to his thinking. Vel sat with that for a moment. 14 years. One person working alone at the start on a project in empty space that was never intended to be found by anyone who didn't already deserve to find it. He picked up the stylus. He signed the chip and placed it back on the table between them. The young officer picked it up and stood and said the fleet's drives would be fully restored within 24 hours. She said there was food available if he wanted it, and that the shuttle back to his flagship would be ready when he was. She said it all in the same tone, the food and the shuttle given the same weight as the terms, and then she left. Vel sat alone in the room for a while. He drank the water on the table. He thought about the young analyst who had said the word trap and been thanked for his contribution, and told to sit down. He thought about what he would say to that analyst when he got back to the ship. He thought about the 14 worlds he hadn't known about, and the 14 years of construction he hadn't known about, and the admiral who had ended a session by thanking an imperial ambassador and going home for the night. He thought that he had come to these coordinates, believing he was going to inspect an offering. He thought that he had been right in a way. It had been an offering, just not the kind he had imagined. It had been an offer of a particular future, extended in the only language an empire fluent in contempt was reliably capable of hearing, and he had heard it, and he had signed for it, and now he was going to go back to his ship and transmit an acknowledgement on Galactic standard channels and turn his fleet around and go home. He stood up. He straightened his uniform, which was a habit and not a statement. He went back through the corridors that smelled like recycled air and metal, and that warm thing he still couldn't identify, and he collected his shuttle, and he went back to his flagship, which now had power again and smelled like his flagship again, and was full of his crew going about restored routines with the particular focus of people who have experienced something they are still processing and have chosen, wisely, to be busy while they do it. He did not think about fear anymore. He thought about preparation instead, and about patience, and about what 14 years of quiet work in empty space looked like from the outside to someone who hadn't known it was happening. It looked like nothing. Right up until it didn't. Ambassador Sela received the news on a Tuesday. She was still at Meridian Station, which had not been her plan. Her plan had been to wait 3 days for the fleet's return confirmation, collect Earth's formal surrender documentation, and depart for the capital with a complete file and a clean record. She had brought enough personal effects for 4 days. She had been here for 11. The station staff had offered her additional supplies twice, and she had accepted without comment because she was a professional and professionals adapted to changed circumstances, without making their feelings about it publicly available. The message came through on the standard Galactic channel, which was a choice that struck her immediately, because internal fleet communications had their own encrypted channels and Vel had no operational reason to use the open Galactic Standard network for a status update, unless he wanted the status update to be heard by everyone who was listening, which was a considerable number of people. Because the Galactic Standard channel was monitored by every major civilization in the known galaxy, as a matter of routine. She read the message twice before she accepted what it said. It was not long. It was structured in the formal language of official Keth military communication, which she knew well enough to understand not just the words but the weight behind them. It said that Fleet Sovereign Drath Vel, acting on behalf of the Keth Empire's 7th Expeditionary Force, acknowledged the engagement at the coordinates and confirmed that terms had been accepted. It named Earth specifically. It named the 14 worlds under Earth's protection, listed by their catalog designations, which told her that Vel had done some reading before transmitting, because the Keth intelligence files had not contained those 14 worlds before this operation, which meant someone had provided the list, which meant the humans had provided it deliberately as part of the terms, which meant they had wanted it on record in Vel's own words on the open channel. She put the message down and looked out the viewport at Earth. She thought about the data chip she had received 11 days ago, the one with no letter, no signature, no explanation, just coordinates. She had written in her report that she did not think it was a mistake. She had been correct about that, which was a small professional satisfaction sitting inside a much larger and less comfortable feeling that she was still working out how to classify. She had two options and they were simple. She could leave. Her shuttle was ready, her staff was ready, and nothing in the terms Vel had accepted required her personal presence for any further step. She could file her report from the ship, transmit the Empire's formal acknowledgement as required, and be home within the week. This was the sensible option, and she was a sensible person. She asked to see Admiral Austin. The response came back within the hour, which told her the Admiral had been expecting the request or something like it. She was given a shuttle slot and a docking bay number and a time, and she arrived at the surface facility with the specific composure of someone who has decided to do a thing and is committed to seeing it through before doubt can organize itself into an argument. Austin met her in a room that was not a formal meeting room. It was a working office, the kind that accumulates the honest residue of actual occupation, stacked reports, a half-full cup of something warm, a window with a view of a garden that had recently been cut. Austin was standing when Sela came in. She did not move to the other side of a table. She stayed where she was and nodded once and said she was glad Sela had stayed. Sela said she wanted to understand something. Austin said she could try. Sela said that the structure field at the coordinates represented a level of resource commitment and construction time that was not consistent with what the Keth intelligence assessment had said about Earth's military development. She said this carefully and without accusation because it was a statement about an intelligence failure that was her Empire's failure and not Austin's, and she was professional enough to own it cleanly. Austin listened. Sela said she wanted to know how long. Not who or how, just how long. Austin looked at her for a moment. Then she said 14 years for the first phase. She said the engineer who had designed it had started with his own resources before the program was formalized, because the program hadn't existed yet, because the threat assessment that justified it hadn't been written yet, because he had understood the necessity before the institutions had caught up to his understanding. Sela was quiet for a moment. She asked how many sites there were. Austin picked up the cup from her desk and held it in both hands and looked at the garden outside the window. She said that was not information she was going to share, but that she appreciated the quality of the question. Sela understood. The answer to that question was not in the terms Vel had signed, which meant it was being retained deliberately, held back not as a threat but as a permanent uncertainty, which was in its own way more effective than a threat because a threat had an edge you could measure and an uncertainty did not. She was looking at a strategy that had been thought through far past the point where most strategies stopped, past the immediate problem and past the solution to the problem, and all the way to what came after the solution and what shape of world you wanted to be living in once the noise had settled. She said because she felt it needed to be said, and she was not going to get another opportunity to say it in a room like this. that the Empire had not known. Austin said she knew. Sela said that was why it had worked. Austin looked at her then fully, with the attention of someone who has heard the thing they expected to hear, and is deciding how to receive it. She said the coordinates were not a weapon. She said they were an answer to a question the Empire had asked, which was, what will you do? And the answer had been this. And this had been waiting in the dark for 14 years for someone to come and see it. Sela transmitted the formal acknowledgement that afternoon from her shuttle, sitting in the bay with the engines warm and her staff quiet around her. She transmitted it on the Galactic Standard channel as required, in the formal language of official Keth communication. And when it was done, she sat for a moment and looked at the transmission log and thought about the 32 worlds that had signed similar documents from the other direction, had transmitted their own acknowledgments of terms from their own shuttle bays or what remained of their government buildings, and about how different this document felt from those, and about what that difference meant for an empire that had built its certainty on the idea that the difference would never exist. She filed her report and departed. Back at the coordinates, the last human shuttles were completing their final runs. The structure field had returned to darkness, cold and still, identical to what the Keth scouts had found when they first arrived, which was nothing, or what looked like nothing from the outside, which was the point, and had always been the point. Chief Engineer Dov Rask was not there to see it. He had not been there for the engagement, and he was not there for the aftermath. He was in a facility that appeared in no public record, at a desk covered in the organized disorder of someone in the middle of thinking, and he was looking at a set of preliminary designs that were still rough at the edges, still full of the kind of gaps that early work always has before the long middle part fills them in. He had been doing this before the fleet arrived at the coordinates, and he was doing it now, and he would be doing it tomorrow. This was not unusual. This was the work, and the work did not stop because one phase of it had concluded, because the work was not really about any single phase. It was about the question underneath all the phases, which was not how do you stop a threat, but how do you become the kind of thing that threats think twice about. And the answer to that question was never finished, only extended, one careful year at a time, in places that were never meant to be found by a friend. Austin received the confirmation of Sela's transmission at her desk in the late afternoon. The garden outside was holding the last of the light, gold and horizontal, the kind of light that makes ordinary things look considered. She read the confirmation, and then she opened the top drawer of her desk and took out the folded piece of paper she had put there 11 days ago and opened it. She read what it said. Then she took a pen and drew a single line through the text, not to erase it, but to mark it as complete, the way you mark something that is finished and can be set down. She folded it again and put it back in the drawer. She picked up a fresh piece of paper. She wrote a report. It was short, as her reports tended to be, covering the sequence of events in plain language without elaboration, beginning with the ambassador's arrival and ending with the confirmation of the Keth withdrawal. She noted the fleet count. She noted the engagement duration. She noted the outcome. At the bottom she wrote, "Matter closed." She filed it and leaned back in her chair and looked at the garden, which was going dark now, the gold fatting out of it, the shapes of things becoming simple and quiet in the early evening. Somewhere in a facility with no public address, Dov Rask was drawing lines on a page and thinking about distances and materials and time. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, a field of structures sat cold and ready and patient, waiting in the same silence it had always kept, the silence of something that had never needed to announce itself to be what it was. Somewhere beyond the system's edge, a Keth fleet was going home. Austin thought about the moment in the council room when she had put the first chip on the table and Sho had picked it up and turned it over in her hands and asked what was on it. She thought about how the question had felt at the time and how it felt now, which was different in a way that was difficult to put into words, but had something to do with the distance between asking what something is and knowing what it was always going to be. The coordinates had been an answer. They had always been an answer. The question had just needed the right person to ask it, loudly enough and publicly enough that the answer could be given in a way that stayed given, that settled into the record of things that had happened and could not be undated or revised or quietly reclassified. It had stayed given. She turned off the light on her desk. She sat for a moment in the dark with the window and the garden and the early stars coming out above it. Then she stood and put on her jacket and went home. The drawer stayed closed. The paper stayed folded. The coordinates stayed where they had always been, sitting in the dark between the stars, not waiting for anyone in particular, just waiting, the way that prepared things wait, with the deep and unhurried patience of something that has already done everything it needed to do and has nothing left to prove to anyone. It was enough. It had always been